Pakusch. Aviation Highlights is a monthly TV program about aviation in and around the Rochester area on cable channel 12. Today we're at Greasetown Mall, where an aviation exhibit is in progress. Sue Giuseppetti will talk with some of the exhibitors later in the show. Recently, Rochester was host to a very prominent individual in the world of aviation. Admiral Donald Engen came to Rochester on April 12 to meet with local reporters and to hold an aviation safety seminar at Sperry High School. He is president of the Air Safety Foundation of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. It's a private nonprofit organization dedicated to improving general aviation air safety in the United States through training, education, and research. Donald Engen was administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration for 3.5 years. His visit to Rochester was sponsored by GRAY, the Genesee Region Aviation Alliance, and by the Rochester Pilots Association. After arriving at Will Air East, Donald Engen answered reporters' questions about air safety, the Eastern Airlines strike, and general aviation.
You know, there are 220,000 general aviation airplanes in the United States, all certificated to fly. There are 4,600 airliners, and there are 23,000, give or take a few, military aircraft. So that gives you the balance of how important general aviation is. Last year, general aviation carried 117 million people, and it beat out American Airlines, it beat out United Airlines. More people flew by general aviation than any other airline in the United States. And I talked to Bob Crandall the other day, and he said, I was just about to claim that we were number one. He says, but we'll get you. Let me give the bottom line first. It is safe, indeed, but how safe is safe? And that's what we're talking about, really. If you stop to think that there are 115,000 flights each day in the positive control zone of the United States, that's a lot of airplanes. And then there is an additional 100,000 flights flown by general aviation, VFR. Aviation is the mainstream of support, general aviation is the mainstream of support for the airlines. And so, as the airlines fly, many people, general aviation feeds the airlines. And if you stop to think that there are 465 million people that flew last year, and it was one of the best years we've had in aviation, I think that's good. Anytime there's an accident, I think it catches everybody's attention. There's something very awe-inspiring about an airplane falling from the sky, particularly to the pilot. It catches everybody's attention. We don't focus on the other accidents that are occurring in the home and the highway as much as we do in aviation. And I think we in aviation have learned to accept that. And so we have a higher standard of safety. We require that airlines maintain their aircraft in a far different way than do the trains or the trucks or the cars of this nation. We require each individual pilot in general aviation to maintain his airplane like no other vehicle is maintained, and he must do that or he cannot certify that airplane to fly. That was a tragic accident at Cerritos. It was one mid-air collision that had very tragic results. I think we found really that both parties were at fault being that they didn't see each other. But there is not a general little airplane, big airplane problem in the sky because we have a good air traffic control system. That's the best in the world. There is none better. Does it make mistakes? Sure it does. Do people make mistakes? Yes, they do. And mistakes cause accidents. I, as a pilot, I, as the president of the AOPA Air Safety Foundation, are always interested to be sure that we don't regulate through panic. We don't legislate or regulate by panic. It's the wrong way to do it. And we must study the regulations carefully. I tell this story many times, but you've got to think of our airspace much like the United States. And we went from the Shenandoah to the Ohio Valley to the Mississippi and on out to the Pacific. And then we filled in between, and at one time we had some very bad range wars, and we had barbed wire fences and couldn't move our cattle north and south. Very bitter time. Well, today in our airspace, it's like the greening of our airspace. We have barbed wire fences in the sky. And so we need to deal with those barbed wire fences, and those of us in general aviation need to accommodate to the rules, certainly, and those in commercial aviation and the airlines need also to accommodate to those rules, and the military as well. It can be done, and I honestly think that this airspace of ours is going to be restructured in the 1990s. The time has come to look at it critically so that all can fly.
Restructured in what way?
Well, right now we have a number of terminal control areas. We have a number of airport radar surveillance advisory areas. We need to look at the need for those. We need to see if the military needs the airspace that it's using out there to train. We need to look at the airline's requirement to fly from A to B as quickly and as most cost efficient as possible, because that affects your ticket and my ticket. We need to look at all these things, and we need to look at carrying the packages all night long, and we need to look at this airspace in a much different way than we ever have before.
What's your biggest safety concern right now?
My biggest safety concern is the fact that if we're going to make inroads and improve this safety, and let me talk just a moment about general aviation, because last year was one of the safest years in general aviation history. In 1976, we had a rate of 16 accidents per 100,000 flying hours. Last year, we were down to a little less than 8 accidents per 100,000 flying hours. I've set as a goal for the Air Safety Foundation to help the FAA and help the United States reduce that to 4 by 1995. We're beginning to get down where we should be. Now, how are we going to do that? The only way we can do that is through the human mind. People cause accidents. People are the reason that we have accidents. Accidents don't happen, they're caused. We need to get into the human mind. We need to make sure that our pilots are flying well trained. We need to be sure that they have been trained well enough to have the certificates that they have. We may need to be sure that they understand aviation physiology, but it comes back to the mind, and we need to look at the air traffic control system the same way. We thought for many years that the age of an airliner didn't make any difference as long as we inspected that airliner, as long as we visually looked at those minute cracks that develop and continue to upgrade the equipment. I think we learned with the Aloha accident off Maui, when the top of that 737 came off, that things are different than we thought. And we need to go back now and look critically at how we judge the age of an airplane. And I was the first to say this, and I will continue to say this. And fortunately, the FAA is looking at this right now and is upgrading its standards. Age of airplanes is different in a pressurized airplane than it is in the Bonanza that I flew up here. The age of a pressurized airplane becomes very critical after a number of cycles, climbing to altitude and down again. With the expansion and contraction of the metal, we need to look at it in a different light than we look at a Bonanza, which can fly up and down with impunity because you don't have any pressurization. It's not the wear and tear on the airplane so much as it's the pulsing of the pressure vessel of the airplane.
As for the Eastern Airlines strike,
really it's a labor management issue, and I don't care who owns the airline, labor and management must come together in some form to have a corporation. It's true of any corporation, and I would hope that labor and management could come together. I would go out on a limb and say that labor with respect to Eastern Airlines has been quite intransigent with respect to Frank Lorenzo, and they're just going to have to work that out.
After the press conference, a dinner was held in Donald Engen's honor. A safety seminar for pilots was held at Sperry High School. Donald Engen reflected on his years as FAA administrator, presented a slideshow about general aviation safety, and answered questions from the audience. Donald Engen spoke about the difficulty that the FAA administrator is having in being able to use the Aviation Trust Fund.
The administrator is trying to spend that trust fund, and he has many constraints on that. Constraints coming from Congress. On one hand, Congress will say, don't spend it. On the other hand, they will say, spend it. The administration, the President of the United States, and his budgeteers are saying, don't spend it. And the administrator, the FAA, is because he is the personification of the FAA, is right in the middle of this thing. And I don't know an administrator who doesn't want to spend that trust fund money for what it's intended.
Although Donald Engen criticized the current FAA as taking a rather antagonistic approach in dealing with pilots who break the rules, he emphasized that the FAA is here to help.
Remember, those individuals are there to help us, and I say us, and they're really not there to get us. Now, having said that, let me talk a little bit about a real concern that I have, and I've spoken to the administrator, the acting administrator of the FAA about this, and I'm part of this in a sense, and I want to kind of talk about it with you. I'm very concerned about the enforcement attitude in the FAA right now. It's not proper. We need to start working within the FAA to begin to come to accommodation with what has become too stiff an enforcement policy. I don't want all you guys to squirm now. I'll let you off the hook, please. And don't, please, once again, don't read this as a former administrator taking out after the FAA. I'm not. I do believe in calling the shot straight, though. I don't mind stiff enforcement if the crime fits the penalty. That's not my problem. But I do see mindless pursuit of minutiae, and we've got to do something about that. I've expressed my concerns, I told you just a minute ago, to the acting administrator, and we've had some good sessions, and we're going to have another one Friday. I'm going to continue to work with the system and try to turn this around.
It's time for the history portion of Aviation Highlights with Paul Roxin. If you saw the April edition of Aviation Highlights, you remember that Paul did a short bit with his clarinet. Well, Paul plays for the Brighton Symphony Orchestra, and we thought he'd lead again with his clarinet.
I'd like to dedicate this to memory of my parents. In 1933, we were greeted with an unexpected incident at the airport. One of the new Boeing 247s being used by United Airlines ran into a severe thunderstorm over Pennsylvania in a flight from Newark to Chicago, and was forced off course and landed here at Rochester. He refueled and then departed for his destination. That was the first we've seen of one of the new low-wing transports, and it was shortly followed thereafter by the Douglas DC-2 and the Douglas DC-3. Had a cruising speed of about 140 miles per hour.
In 1935, people started to use the airlines quite a bit, but also was a period, one of the worst aviation tragedies happened, and 2 people were killed. One was Wiley Post. He was killed, and Will Rogers was a passenger with him. He was killed in Alaska. That sent aviation back tremendously. A lot of people who had developed a urge to fly and were flying the airlines became fearful. And just to go backtrack a little bit, in 1933, Wiley Post flew around the world by himself. And that was a demonstration of the automatic pilot. And on August 29th, 1933, he came in here. And I was given the responsibility of cleaning up his airplane. We have a number of pictures of it here. And I met Wiley Post, and there was it was quite a thrill to rub elbows with somebody who was so well known. And when he took off, he did something that was very dangerous, which none of us would, none of the pilots would care to do too often. He used to call it a hang it on prop. Now take up and go into a climbing turn with the nose way up in the air. Well, today the airlines, they have so much power, they can do that. But in those days, but if that engine never faltered for a little bit, you were right in a perfect stall, was ready for a spin. The planes that they had back in those days, they're far different from what they were, what the planes were today. Today the planes are aerodynamically designed so they can spin. But in those days, if you stall, that thing could fall into a spin. And you know, a spin is really a plane out of control. And I've been involved in a number of spins there, and it's the one maneuver which I didn't like and a lot of other people didn't. But it was all part of your examination when you went up for a test. The first part of your test was you had to go and do 2 spins. For a private license, you could do any number of turns, 1, 2, or 3 turns. The way you put a plane into a spin was to pull back on the stick, and on certain planes you had to force it into a spin, and it was like a power stall. And just as she starts to whip, if you're going into a spin to right, you kick right rudder, and then go, and you can lose. It's amazing. You can lose 800 feet a second in a spin, and the way you get out of a spin, of course, is then you have to push your controls in the opposite direction. You got the stick back. If you're going to right spin, then the stick goes forward, all the way forward in the opposite, and you kick left rudder. And you got to allow, it takes about half a turn to stop the spin. And many accidents, because people got in the spin and didn't want to pull back on the stick. They only cause them to made to spin a longer time. Some of the planes that were developed for training in World War I, the Jennies, were notorious for that. They used to say it took off, cruised, and landed at 70 miles an hour, and if they fell below that speed, it wouldn't just stall. It would go right into a spin. There have been a number of accidents in the area.
Aviation Highlights is a monthly TV show on cable channel 12. It's on at different times during the month in different towns in the city of Rochester. If you can't find a listing of times in the suburban newspapers, you can get a schedule by joining the Rochester Pilots Association. They have a monthly newsletter that keeps members up to date on all the important aviation issues in the Rochester area, and you don't have to be a pilot to join. Anyone interested in aviation can join. On the weekend of April 29th, the Experimental Aviation Association sponsored an aviation exhibit at Greasetown Mall. We're going to take some time now for Sue Giuseppetti to talk with some of the exhibitors.
Ever since Orville and Wilbur Wright got their homemade aeroplane off the ground, man has been fascinated by flying. Flying in all forms was represented by the aviation show at Greasetown Mall, April 29th and 30th. And even creative geniuses like Orville and Wilbur may have been skeptical about the ability of some of these birds to leave the ground. Or if they do leave the ground, staying up. I'm here with Bill Shaw, who is the past treasurer of the Experimental Aviation Association, and he is also the chairperson for the Oshkosh Airlift, this area's chapter. Hi, nice to be with you today. Can you explain to us what experimental aircraft is?
Well, it's originally started back in the early 50s and by Paul Poberezny, and there were a bunch of fellows that were interested in building their own aircraft, and they used to do it back in the 20s and 30s. All aircraft were so-called experimental at that time, and so they wanted to reactivate that privilege with the government. So Paul started this group up in the early 50s, and through mainly his efforts, we've been able to get those rights restored to rebuild aircraft. And the organization is made up primarily of people who build and or design their own aircraft. Also, just people who are interested in aviation. And it's really been a great help to the aviation community because they've sponsored and supported a lot of legislation that favors general aviation.
Well, what kind of aircraft would be considered experimental? Can you tell us different types, and would we know any of them?
Well, almost any type of aircraft can be experimental. Primarily an experimental aircraft is one who is the only one of its kind. There is no what they call standard certification or certificate of airworthiness for experimental aircraft. The type of certification they have is what they call experimental, and as such have different rules for building. They are required to be inspected by the FAA to make sure they meet certain minimum standards. Then when the airplane is built, the FAA licenses it to fly or certifies it to fly, and then the person has to be confined within a certain area for so many hours before they'll approve him for flying elsewhere.
Perhaps the strangest looking plane at the show is the ultralight. I'm here with Phil Hayes, who is one of the coordinators of the aviation show here today at Greasetown Mall. And we're standing in front of Phil's ultralight.
Yes.
We wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it. What is an ultralight? What does it do? And how long have these been around? I've never seen one before. I think it's kind of unusual.
Ultralights have been around for probably about the last 10 years. The FAA defines an ultralight now as being an aircraft that weighs no more than 254 pounds, can fly no faster than 63 miles an hour. It's allowed to carry 5 gallons of fuel, only one person, and it doesn't require a license. It's strictly a recreational plane for a lot of fun.
It doesn't require a license, so does that mean it doesn't fall under federal aviation regulations?
No, it still falls under what we call FAR 103, which is a guideline that the FAA has given us to allow us this privilege, if you will, of flying airplanes, but without a lot of the expense and complications of medical exams, expensive flight schools, and things of that nature. We still recommend that people get instruction to learn how to fly these things safely, but we don't have a lot of the overhead.
Now, where would they get instruction to learn, and how much would instruction cost? Is it the same as going through a pilot's training?
No, instruction is probably going to cost you $50 to $100. There's a flight school down in Horseheads that is kind of the ultralight hub of New York State, if you will, where they provide safe training in two-seater ultralights that have been specially modified, and they want to make it a safe sport. People getting killed and hurt don't do anything good for our sport that we have here.
I have to say, it doesn't looks like it might be a dangerous vehicle to run. Are there any statistics on the safety record of an ultralight, or is
when ultralights first came out, they developed a bad reputation, and quite literally so. There were a lot of unsafe designs out there. People were trying to make them as cheaply as possible. There was quite typically the $3,000 ultralight. There aren't many of those pilots around today to tell about that, and it's unfortunate. These planes have all been stress tested. They've been designed by people with, in a lot of cases, aeronautical engineering degrees and so on. They've been refined considerably over the past several years.
But you do put them together from a kit, is that right?
Yes, we put them together from a kit. Anybody with a reasonable amount of mechanical ability and just a few shop tools can put these together. They aren't anything exotic. They don't require any special tools or things of that nature at all.
But if you put it together incorrectly, couldn't that ultimately affect the safety of the vehicle?
It could, but any person who values his skin is going to have somebody that's knowledgeable take a look at it before he goes up flying in it.
One of the most exciting forms of flying demonstrated is called aerobatic or sport aerobatics, a division of the Experimental Aircraft Association. This home video was shot by Chuck Kruger, a local sport aerobatic pilot. Okay, Chuck, can you tell us a little bit about the Acrobatic Flying Club?
Okay, we're based out at the Prairie Warsaw Airport. We're just a small local organization right now that we're trying to expand and get a little bit larger. We're having our meetings on Saturdays out at the airport at 2 o'clock. What we're trying to do is promote aerobatics in the area and safe flying in general. Aerobatics makes you a better pilot. Learn to fly the airplane around all 3 axes. On a Pitts S1S, it's a single-seat airplane. and it weighs about 730 pounds, has about 200 horsepower, and it performs very well right up to the unlimited level competition. There's 4 levels of competition: sportsman, intermediate, advanced, and unlimited. And as you go up, the maneuvers get more difficult. And
What would be an example of a beginner kind of maneuver that you would learn to do?
okay, the sportsman sequence, you typically do things like loops, hammerheads, slow rolls, and half Cuban 8s, that kind of thing. As you progress up into like the unlimited, which is the top class, now you're doing things like tail slides, where the airplane actually goes vertically straight up and then falls over backwards. Torque rolls, where you roll continuously up and then the airplane continues to roll as it comes back down. So plus you get lower. In sportsman, you don't do any maneuvers at a contest below about 1,500 feet, where unlimited, you're down to about 300 feet off the ground. Instruction.
And what about the plane? Do you need a special plane?
Some of the older airplanes, the Cubs and Taylor Crafts and things like that, can do aerobatics and Cetabrias and compete in the sportsman, maybe up to the intermediate level.
If you are interested in any of these organizations, contact the Rochester Pilots Association. This is Sue Giuseppetti for Aviation Highlights.
That'll do it for this show. Join us again in June for another edition of Aviation Highlights.